Hey, good morning, everyone. Too loud? No? Okay, good. Okay, so welcome. Thank you for coming out this morning. My name is Scott Galbach. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago in the Political Science Department and the Harris School of Public Policy, and it's great to be back in Kiev. So let me tell you a little bit about me before we get started with today's material. I actually grew up on a farm in central Illinois, about 3 hours south of Chicago. We had pigs and corn and soybeans, and it's a pretty good-sized farm. And my parents liked to travel, and in 1987, we took a tour mostly of Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, but also 4 days in what was then the Soviet Union. So we took a train from Helsinki to Leningrad, spent 2 days there, flew to Moscow, spent 2 days there. That was it. Just those 4 days, those two cities. But from that time period, I think there was an interest in maybe the Soviet Union and then what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. But at that point, I still thought I was going to go home and run the family farm. After college, I went to college. I studied agricultural economics. I went to business school, got an MBA, still thinking I would go home and run the family business, the family farm. And then probably some little piece of me knew that that's not what I wanted to do. And anyway, I wasn't ready to do that. And I found a job working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for the member of Congress from my home district who was on the House Agriculture Committee. I had a farm background. I was from his district, and so I did his Agriculture Committee work for him. And so while I was living in D.C., working for this Republican member of Congress, I became a Democrat. And so that was not a long-term trajectory. That was not a steady state, as we say in economics. And I started thinking about what I wanted to do next, and at that point I knew that I didn't want to go home and run the family farm, but I wasn't sure what to do. And one day we had a constituent, so somebody who lived in our district, come to our office to tell us about his trip to Ukraine. So this was in 1994, early 1994. He was a farmer, this constituent of ours, and he had just gotten back from Ukraine on a farmer-to-farmer exchange, an opportunity for farmers to meet each other. And he was on Capitol Hill telling us about the program, selling the program to make sure it got funded, again, the next budget. And I just got very excited about his experience, and I remember that trip in 1987, and I decided more or less on the spot that I was going to move to a post-communist country. Like that was, as capacious as the dream was at that point. And I didn't know exactly what that meant, but it took me about 6 months to figure out what I could do, and what I ultimately found was a job that used my MBA, the only time in my life that I've used my MBA, working in Prague, in the Czech Republic, with Czech entrepreneurs who were trying to get bank loans and needed help writing business plans. And so we helped them to write business plans. So we had a group of American MBAs in this office, and also offices in Bratislava and a couple of other cities in that part of the world, helping entrepreneurs, Czech and Slovak entrepreneurs, to write business plans. And we saw some good ones. We saw some really terrible ones. I remember one day somebody came to our office with a business plan for a pyramid scheme. Where everybody, you put in $1 and then you find 2 people. And he's like, this is a great idea. This works for everybody, right? It's amazing. Everybody can get rich in a very short period of time. And so I think he wasn't actually a criminal. I think he was just confused about the math. And so we took out a calculator. It's like, what's 2 times 2 times 2, times 2, times 2. It's like, what is the population of the Czech Republic? Finally convinced him this was not such a good plan. There was another guy who wanted to start a pizza delivery business. This is 1994. This is before mobile phones that you have in your pocket. And one of our Czech employees thought to ask him if he had a telephone. It was like kind of important for a delivery business, right? And he said, no, 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 but my neighbor has a phone. I think I can use his. So anyway, so I did this for a year. And then I met an economist at the Central European University, which has moved around over the years. You maybe know the story. Recently been pushed out of Budapest by Viktor Orban. But at the time had campuses in Budapest and Warsaw and Prague. The economics department was in Prague. And I started working for this economist in the economics department as his research assistant. And that was just an amazing 2 years. I spent 1 year doing this in Prague, and then the economics department moved to Budapest, and I spent a year doing this in Budapest. I traveled with this economist. We'll see his picture in a little bit. John Earl is one of my co-authors on a paper that I'll discuss today. Traveled with him to Mongolia on a couple of trips to help design an enterprise privatization plan for the country of Mongolia. It was really an incredible experience. And during those 2 years, in 1996, when I was living in Budapest, that was I think when I had first moved to Budapest, that was my first trip to Kiev. So I bought a train ticket and came to Kiev and saw what a beautiful city this is. And so then after that, graduate school in political science and economics, and I went to graduate school knowing that I wanted to work on the questions of the post-communist transition, and that's what I did for a long time. And more recently, my work has moved in other directions. So as Russia became autocratic, I began to study the political economy of autocracies, authoritarian states, and that's been a big part of my career. I've done a bit of work in Ukraine using firm-level data, written a few papers. I'll talk about one of those today. And I've done increasingly historical work looking at the period in the 19th century after the emancipation of the serfs, or in the early 20th century during the 1905 revolution, and much of the action there obviously happens in what is today Ukraine. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. The one other thing I want to say before I start, maybe you know this already, but I'm here partly as a representative of my university, partly, I suppose, as a representative of my country. And so I just want to be sure that you all know the incredible support that there is in my country for Ukraine and for its independence. And so here's a couple of pictures. This is Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This is the main bridge across the Chicago River. It's like the bridge in the center of the city. And here you see the US flag, the flag of the state of Illinois, and of course, the flag of Ukraine. Here's a building on my campus with an exhibit. You can see From Lviv with Love here on the side of the building. It's everywhere. You go to any city in America. I grew up in a small town of 15,000 people. You see people hanging Ukrainian flags from the front porch. The t-shirt I'm wearing today, you see these are chess pieces. This is the World Chess Hall of Fame in St. Louis, Missouri. There's a guy who was a major investor who created this thing, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And it's where all of the US chess championships are held, and in 2 of the 5 major chess tournaments every year held in St. Louis in this place. And in the gift shop, there's no particular connection to Ukraine at the Chess Hall of Fame, more than to any other country, but in the gift shop they sell these shirts. So, it's everywhere. Slava Ukraini. We understand, I think, I hope, what's happening, and we're with you. So. Okay, so we're going to talk about two related topics today. Damage from war and recovery from wartime damage. And so when we talk about damage, there are, of course, many, many different dimensions that we could discuss. There's the physical damage from war. Stuff gets destroyed. There's the emotional damage, which I suspect is quite deep for many of you. There's the damage to society, the familial damage as members of our families are lost. And all of this damage is quite obviously profound. One fact that we're going to discuss today is that at least when it comes to the physical damage, the recovery from this damage can be surprisingly robust. And so we're going to focus today on the physical damage from war. You know what I'm talking about. This is a picture from the debris that fell from the airstrike the night before last here in Kiev. Something that fell on a house. The Kakhovka Dam that was blown up. So it's a lot of physical infrastructure has been destroyed over the course of this war. And we think about the consequences of that destruction. Obviously, this affects many, many different aspects of life and of the economy. One particular aspect, and maybe a relatively small one, but one that I looked at with some co-authors I'll introduce in a second, is the financial consequences of damage to loan collateral. So, I don't know, you guys are a pretty young group. Anybody taken out a loan before? Anybody in here? Andre, take out a loan. Do they expect anything from you in return? Maybe, yeah. So, you know, typically you take out a loan. You promise that if you don't pay back the loan, that the bank will be able to seize some asset. So you buy a house. The house serves as collateral for the loan. If the loan is not paid back, then the bank can seize the house. And so you think about then what happens to a business that has had collateral that's been damaged over the course of a war. Maybe some building that they put up as collateral for a loan has had a piece of a missile drop on it. And the value of that collateral is not what it was when the loan was originally taken out. And so in principle, you could imagine a couple of financial consequences of damage to collateral. First, it may just be difficult to take out new loans. There are fewer assets available to pledge against a loan that could be received from a bank. Second, think about existing loans. Existing loans are often refinanced, they're rolled over, there's a change in the interest rate. You might want to refinance the loan. You have a loan for working capital just for 6 months. You need to refinance that working capital loan at the end of the 6-month period. And if the collateral is damaged, it may be difficult to do that. And so this could then lead to a default, an inability to pay, to repay the existing loan as well. And so this is what in the economics literature is referred to as the collateral channel, the channel through which collateral values can affect the broader economy. And economists who study the Great Depression, almost 100 years ago, now understand that part of the cause of the Great Depression was the decline in asset values, which then led to an inability to secure loans because of an inability to put up sufficient collateral. And so then that led to reduced investment and so on and so forth, and you have 10 years of reduced economic activity. And so our question was whether the damage to collateral that is a consequence of this war has any downstream consequences for Ukraine's financial system. So that's the question we wanted to ask. So how much has Russia's war in Ukraine damaged the collateral of Ukrainian firms, and how much damage has that caused to the Ukrainian financial system? Okay, so I keep saying we. So who is we? So we had a great team of co-authors. Maybe some of you here know who some of these people are. You're nodding your head over here. Who do you know? No, you just read the article. Okay, good for you. Okay. Okay, so Solomia Shpak was Max's advisor here at KSC. She's a faculty member at the Kiev School of Economics, and she also has a research position at the National Bank of Ukraine. John Earle was that economist I was telling you about earlier. He's the economist for whom I worked for 2 years before graduate school. He's now at George Mason University, just outside of Washington, D.C., and we've continued to work together over the years. And Maria Panka is also a graduate of KSC, who then went to work at the National Bank of Ukraine for several years, and is now a PhD student at George Mason, working with John. And Solomia received her PhD also from George Mason. So that was our group. That's the we who were trying to answer this question. Okay. So you probably know that lots of academic projects take years and years and years. I have papers that were, I don't know, 8 years from start to finish. The first idea, the first conversation to when the paper is finally accepted, 7, 8 years. This is an incredibly fast project by academic standards. We began working on this last September. In, I don't know, October, November, I think we learned that there was going to be a special issue of the Journal of Comparative Economics on Ukraine. Yuri Godnichenko asked us if we would be interested in submitting an article for this special issue. We said, yeah, we're working on this question of collateral. By January, we had something, and by June, the paper was accepted. So that's about as fast as it gets in academia, from September to June. Okay, so we wanted to do something quickly because we wanted to say something now about the effects of the war on Ukraine's financial system. But that comes with a big caveat, which is that we're using very preliminary data. So this is not the last word on this topic. The primary data sources for this paper are, first of all, a survey conducted by the National Bank of Ukraine of collateral conditions among borrowers from Ukrainian banks as of July 1st of last year. Okay, so March, April, May, June, so 4 months after the full-scale invasion. And then we matched those survey data with loan data as of February of last year, so data that were reported just before the invasion, and then as of November of last year, so far enough down the line that we could observe some consequences of the damage to collateral that was documented through this survey of NBU. And so the basic design was essentially this. So we had information on damage to collateral. So if there was a collateral asset, could have been a building, could have been a piece of land, could have been a piece of machinery. If there was a collateral asset that was pledged against some loan, the bank responsible for that loan could indicate whether they knew that the asset was damaged or whether there's just no information about the asset or control over the asset was lost, presumably because it was behind enemy lines. Sort of a series of categories that all constituted some sort of loss of the value of that asset. And so a first question in the paper then is how damage to collateral in turn affects the value of collateral that's pledged against any particular loan. So we have loans that we observe in February and loans that we observe in November. So we track the same loans over time. And we know what's reported to the banks about the value of that collateral at those 2 points in time. And we can then look at the relationship between that change in collateral value, specifically the change in the collateral loan ratio for individual loans, to whether or not there was any damage to the collateral assets that were pledged against those loans. And then ultimately, we're interested in what's happening at the firm level as a consequence of all of this. And so there are 4 outcomes that we can measure. So first of all, we know whether or not that borrower defaulted on its loans. So that's one. Remember, like an inability to refinance because collateral value has declined may make it difficult to refinance a loan. May make it difficult to repay a loan, leading to default. Second, we know what the bank itself estimated the default risk to be for that borrower. So there's a formula, and banks apply this formula to individual loans to determine the probability of default, so we can look at that. Third, we can see whether or not that borrower took out any new loans between February and November. And fourth, we can look at the share of new loans in that borrower's loan portfolio. Okay. Now, what do we have to worry about here? There's always a lot to worry about, right? And so one of the things that we need to worry about here is, well, first of all, this thing is probably measured with a lot of error, right? So banks are probably slow to revalue collateral on their books. They maybe, again, they don't have complete information about what's happening to this collateral. And so we're undoubtedly measuring changes in collateral value with a lot of error. That's one thing. You know, as always, there could be other things that are going on at the same time that affect both. In econometrics, we would say this is on the right-hand side, right? So our determinant of interest. And what's on the left-hand side are outcomes of interest. This change in collateral value doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of a war that is affecting economic activity in the area in which a business is located. And so we need to be sure that we're not confusing the change in collateral value with what's happening more generally in the local economy. There may be other things to worry about. So in the language of econometrics, the concern, if we just ignored this and we just regressed these outcomes on the change in collateral value, undoubtedly somebody in the audience would raise their hand and say, but wait a second, isn't collateral value endogenous? By which they could mean any number of things, but essentially that there's some confound, something that could suggest a relationship when in fact there is no causal relationship to be had. Okay, and so in the language of econometrics, then what we're looking for is a plausibly exogenous source of variation in the change in collateral value. We're looking for an instrument or an instrumental variable for the change in collateral value, and for us, that's the damage to collateral. So the idea here is let's soak up as much of what's happening in the local business environment as we can. So, for example, by including controls for whether or not the business or the collateral physically sits in a rayon that has been directly affected by the war, where there's been fighting, occupation, direct consequence of the war. And having done that, then the assumption is that the damage to collateral is the debris falls on some buildings and not on others, and that's as if random. It's just idiosyncratic whether this piece of collateral is destroyed versus that piece of collateral, controlling for the fact that we know that there's a general change in the local business environment as a consequence of direct exposure to the war. Okay, and then we try to soak up other stuff, so we include fixed effects, so essentially just a dummy variable, a control for the general part of the country in which the business physically sits. And we include fixed effects for the bank, because maybe this bank has suffered just a general decline in asset values, and that could affect their ability to provide new loans. So we want to control for that as well. And so the assumption then, what we would say the identifying assumption, is that after all of this, damage to collateral, first of all, needs to be correlated with change in collateral value, which I'll show you in a second that that's true. That's something that we can verify. But then second, we need to assume, and this is not something that we can directly verify, but just something that we have to take on faith, we assume that having controlled for all of this stuff, the damage to collateral affects the firm level outcomes only through change in collateral value, that there's no direct consequence of damage to collateral on the probability that the firm defaults on its loans, the probability that it receives new loans on these outcomes. Okay, so hold on to that idea for a second. We're going to come back to that. And you may be thinking here about what are the ways in which that assumption might fail, and how can we try to be sure that that's not a problem. Okay. Is that clear, what we're doing? Yes? I should have asked before I started. I don't know how many of you are new students and how many of you are alumni and how many of you maybe studied something else in university. Who's had econometrics before in here? Ah, okay, good. Okay, so this is new. This is new for a lot of you. Who's going to have econometrics very soon? Not many. So how many of you are students at KSC? Not many. Well, but you're not going to have econometrics? No?
I think
You call it statistics?
I understand that they're going to have regression analysis as part of the applied mathematics course for bachelor starting this year. Also, not on.
I assure you, you'll see this. Okay. So what do we find? So first of all, remember, for this empirical strategy to work, this needs to be correlated with this, and it is strongly correlated. So damage to collateral is highly correlated and negatively correlated with change in collateral value. So borrowers that have seen some physical damage to their collateral report lower collateral values in November relative to February compared to borrowers that did not experience damage to collateral. Okay. That's one. Two, let's take then a change in collateral value sort of within the range of what we observe for borrowers in our data. Let's say a 10% reduction in collateral value. What impact would that 10% reduction have on these firm level outcomes? So that 10% reduction in collateral value is induced by damage to collateral. We estimate that the default rate for the borrower would increase by 8 percentage points. So that's, I don't know, does that sound like a little, a lot? It's a lot, actually. So the average default rate is, during the period that we examine, is 12%. So an increase of 8 percentage points is 2/3 of the average default rate. It's, this is a really sizable magnitude. Second, the bank's estimate that the borrower is going to default on its loans increases by 4%, which is interesting. That's smaller. 4% is larger than 8%. And so part of what's going on here probably is that banks are slow to update their estimates of what's happening as a consequence of changes to collateral values. So in a sense, what we're observing in the data is a little bit ahead of what the banks themselves estimate is going to happen, which could imply that there are further defaults to come. Third, the probability of a new loan declines by about 8 percentage points. So is that a little or a lot? Well, you need to know what the average probability of a new loan is. The average probability of a new loan is around 20, it's in the paper, 24, 25%, something like that. So this is around a third, if I remember correctly, of the average value. So that's a reasonably large magnitude. And new lending falls by 2 percentage points, which is a little smaller relative to the average value, but still an important consequence. So this is all seemingly bad news for part of Ukraine's economy, right? So this collateral channel story that the inability to invest through lending as a consequence of a decline in collateral value can have significant consequences for the broader economy. And so one important question, I think, going forward is, first of all, do we observe these sorts of relationships if we look at a longer period of time following the full-scale invasion? And second, are firms able to find other means of financing investment to the extent that their existing collateral has been destroyed? Now, you might still be thinking, I'm not sure. I believe the results. What about this? What about that? So, you give a presentation of this sort, to a room full of economists, and all of the questions are going to be about this thing up here, the assumption that damage to collateral has no direct effect on firm-level outcomes. And typically, a bunch of hands will come up, and people will say, what about this? What about that? You know, I'm not sure this equation is identified because you haven't thought of such and such. So I don't know. Is there any, you think about any channel through which damage to collateral might affect firm-level defaults or new lending other than through change in collateral value? Good. So you read the paper. Yeah, so, sorry, can you say it again?
Well, the asset doesn't bring the income after it was destroyed. This was in the paper?
This was in the paper. Good.
It was just from the overall situation, because when the department store is destroyed, it cannot have more shops that bring income and so on.
Precisely correct. So what if what was destroyed was the store, the actual physical store, and without that storefront, there's no way to bring in new revenue. So with no way to bring in new revenue, the probability of default is going to increase. That seems like that would be a violation of our exclusion restriction, is the language that we would use. Okay, so how could we check for that? What could we do to try to rule out that possibility? What do we do in the paper? Does anybody remember?
Yeah, I can just say it aloud. They wouldn't report anything in their financial statements. They would like have income zero or any other new, I don't know. There would just be no money there.
Yeah.
And maybe they wouldn't also have any, if they won't have any income, then they wouldn't be able to pay the tax from that income as well.
Yeah. So as the researcher, we need to worry about that. And so one way of productively worrying about that, which we did in the paper, is to say, well, let's just restrict attention to non-production assets. So we know the type of collateral that is pledged, and we know which collateral is directly attached to the business activity and which is not. And so maybe there's some, I don't know, some land, not necessarily even directly where the business is located, that's pledged as collateral. And so damage to structures on that land, as long as it's not the direct business establishment, should have less consequence for the firm's ability to bring in new revenue. So because we know the type of collateral asset, then we can look at our data and say, let's only examine damage to collateral that is not directly connected to the business establishment, to non-production assets. And do we see similar effects? And in fact, we do. So that's I think, the last two tables in the paper. We show that, in fact, the estimated magnitudes are quite similar to what we get in our baseline exercise if we only look at damage to collateral that are non-production assets. Okay. So I don't know. Maybe there's something else that we need to worry about that we didn't. Somebody's going to tell me you should have done this, and the paper's already gone to press, and it'll be too late. I mean, I guess the other question here is, you think of this as like a general design. Are there other wartime phenomena that we could examine using a similar design? Not necessarily damage to collateral per se, but some other consequence of the war, and then some downstream consequences that we want to examine. I don't know if anybody's thinking of a design like that. A few of you took a photo, go home, put the photo on your screensaver, think about, what would be a similar paper that we could write? Not necessarily looking at these variables, but with the same sort of design. Okay. So that's damage, okay? So I'm going to move on to recovery in a second here, but any questions about this? This is the pessimistic part of the lecture, and now we're going to move to the somewhat more optimistic part of the lecture, okay? So, recovery. After the war and even during the war comes recovery. And recovery means a lot of different things. There are many ways to think about recovery. There's a blueprint, which any of you seen this blueprint that Timothy Milovanov and Yuri Godinichenko and a group of other economists have put together. Max, you've seen this, right? So the blueprint that was put together earlier this year, thinking through what recovery in Ukraine will look like. There are different dimensions to recovery. So first question is, who will pay for recovery? So there's enormous need. Where is the money going to come from to rebuild Ukraine's cities, to rebuild Ukraine's schools, to rebuild the country? And so I think my personal view, and I hope this is where we end up, is that to a first approximation, Russia will pay for that. So there are hundreds of billions of dollars that have been seized by the US and other countries, assets of the Russian central bank, also assets of Russian oligarchs and so forth. Those are somewhat smaller in magnitude, but that these assets should be available to pay for the recovery. That's obviously a topic of ongoing discussion, but I think many of us in the field strongly believe that that should be the case. Hundreds of billions of dollars are going to be flowing into the country at some point. How are we going to ensure that the money is directed toward the proper use, that it's not siphoned off by particular individuals? And so there are questions of institutional design. So what is the design of the organizations, of the process, the decisions that will be made? Who makes the decisions about how money is allocated? In areas especially like Mariupol that have been almost completely destroyed, there's going to be a question of many villages, smaller settlements throughout the east of the country especially. There are going to be questions about whether those places should be rebuilt according to the previous plan, whether they should be built in a different way, whether perhaps they should be rebuilt at all. And in thinking about recovery, there's obviously the question of how long all of this is going to take. So we're talking about a few years, a decade. What does historical experience tell us? So I want to focus today on a particular aspect of recovery, which is recovery of cities. So Russia's war on Ukraine is substantially a war on Ukraine's cities. So there's obviously, first of all, the physical damage to residential and non-residential real estate and to infrastructure. So estimate of folks here at KSE is that as of the end of February, earlier this year, that physical damage amounted to approximately $145 billion. Okay, to put that into perspective, that's roughly equal to the annual GDP for Ukraine. For purposes of comparison, In my country, there was a big infrastructure bill that was passed in 2021. This is the largest infrastructure bill to be passed in more than a decade. It was enormously politically controversial, barely got through the Senate and the House to be signed by the president. And the new spending in that bill, remember, fiscal damage here roughly equal to 100% of Ukraine's annual GDP. The new spending in that infrastructure bill in my country was approximately 2% of annual GDP. This enormously controversial piece of legislation that took every bit of political capital that the president had to pass. We're talking about 2% of GDP. So this is an enormously large task, just addressing the physical damage to Ukraine's cities. There's also the decline in population in many of these cities. What is a city at the end of the day? A city is its people. Without people, there is no city. Decline in population due to mortality, emigration, either abroad or to other cities within the country, deportation, and reduced fertility. Ukraine already had fertility below the replacement rate, as we say. Population was already declining, and many families are just holding off having children until the war is over. And so all of this as well affects cities. There's internal migration, as I've mentioned. Cities are cultural centers as well, and there's damage to and looting of cultural artifacts in many of these cities. So I don't need to tell you about this, but just to say that if you look from above Mariupol, in the center of the city, essentially every building has been destroyed. This is not the first time that we've seen this sort of destruction of cities as a consequence of war. So at the end of World War II, in 1945, when the United States came within range of Japan to fly B-29 bombers over Japanese cities, dozens of Japanese cities were attacked from the air, what today we would call a war crime. 66 cities were targeted, most of them with incendiary bombs, bombs that have gasoline, that produce fires, cause the cities to burn down. And of course, 2 cities that were attacked with nuclear bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 80,000 people were killed in Hiroshima. 80,000 people were killed in Tokyo on the first day that Tokyo was attacked. And Tokyo was attacked repeatedly. Here you see Tokyo burning from the air on my birthday in 1945. So in these cities that were targeted, 66 cities in Japan, half of all buildings and 2/3 of manufacturing capacity was destroyed. 300,000 Japanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians, and 40% of the overall population of the country of Japan was made homeless. And there was massive outmigration from bombed cities. Not every city was bombed. Not every city was within range of American bombers. And so people moved from cities that were being bombed to cities that were not. So it seems like the consequence of this bombing for those cities must have been, obviously in the short term, was absolutely devastating. The question is, what happened to those cities in the medium term and the long term? Well, I've been to Japan. This is what Tokyo looks like today. This famous crossing in the center of the city. It's a booming city. It's, by some counts, the largest metropolitan area in the world, roughly 35 million people in and around the city of Tokyo. And you say, well, that's Tokyo. At least, it was bombed, but it wasn't attacked with a nuclear weapon. But Hiroshima as well rebuilt after the war. This is oddly one building in the very center of the city that survived largely intact from the bombing and remains as a monument to the bombing. But Hiroshima today, if you just look at the long-term population trend in Hiroshima, if you were to just have extrapolated from growth from 1925 to 1930 to 1935 to 1940, if you didn't know that the war happened, if you didn't know that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, you would have predicted that the population in 1975 would have been basically exactly what it was in 1975. Hiroshima just returned to its long-term path. The same thing with Nagasaki. When thinking about what can happen to cities after a war, it's maybe useful to think about economic geography more generally. So what does theory tell us about how cities grow, about how the population of cities relates, the population of one city relates to that of another, and about what might happen when you have an enormous shock to the population growth of those cities and to the physical infrastructure of those cities as a consequence of war. So roughly speaking, how many of you read this paper today? This is a good paper, right? I mean, this is actually, I think this is a really sweet paper. It's really nice. So this paper, as this paper discusses, there are three main theories of economic geography that are useful here. So first broad theory we can call increasing returns. The basic idea is the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. If you're thinking about the big get bigger, the small get smaller. So it's useful if you're in some line of business to be located next to other people who were located in the same line of business. What is this building here? Anybody know? Sorry? It's Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, California. Yeah, that's right. Silicon Valley, it's not a coincidence that many of the major technology firms are located all within about 20 kilometers of each other on a peninsula south of San Francisco, an area that we call Silicon Valley. It's useful, if you're in that business, to have people who work in that business around you. It's easier to move somebody from one employment to another if they don't actually have to move their family, move their kids to a different school, sell one house, buy another. They can just slightly change their commute and work for the business down the road. It's useful to have venture capital firms who are located in the area, and they're located there because that's where all the businesses are. It's useful to have universities like Stanford and Berkeley where research is done that's relevant to the field and that produce graduates who then want to work for these companies. And so one theory of economic geography is that you see an agglomeration of economic activity, that similar types of economic activity locate next to each other. And you can generalize this and just say, well, why do cities exist at all? Why aren't we just distributed uniformly across the country? Cities exist because, I don't know, would you have come to this lecture this morning if you live 50 kilometers away? No, right? So it's, you live 50 kilometers away? 75, okay, good. So, okay. The exception that proves the rule, right? So you had to be here. But, Well, okay, so fantastic. So if you lived in Lviv, would you have come to the lecture this morning? Probably not. Okay, fine. Okay, good. So in general, with some exceptions, cities exist because there are lots of things that are easier if you just live close to other people. Okay? And so that's agglomeration. So that's one theory of economic geography. A second theory of economic geography is, well, you look at cities, it's like, I don't know why cities grow, why cities shrink, but let's just assume that every year there's some shock to the city. So maybe the city gets a major investment through a national infrastructure bill that's been passed. Or maybe the city has, I don't know, Detroit is heavily invested in the automobile industry. In the 1970s, Detroit faces competition from Japanese automobile firms, and the city sees a decline in population. Or a city is shocked because of the damage from war. That there are just shocks that happen to cities, and if we just assume sort of naively that those shocks happen, and then the next period the shock doesn't depend on what happened the previous period, an interesting implication of that is that the population of cities should line up, in fact, exactly the way that we see when we look at data for particular countries. So there's this amazing empirical, anybody seen this before, Zipf's law in any context? It's an amazing empirical relationship that applies not just to cities but to other things as well, that suggests that in the context of cities, a city's population should be inversely proportional to its rank by population. So Kiev is the largest city. Kharkiv is the second largest city. Odessa the third largest. Zipf's law says that Kiev should be about twice as large as Kharkiv, about 3 times as large as Odessa, and so on and so forth. And if you just plot, this is for hundreds of cities, any city with a population of at least 10,000 as of 2014, if you just plot population against rank, that's exactly what you see. You do this for any country, you'll find the same relationship. You do this for words, you find the same relationship. What's the most common word in the Ukrainian language? Any guesses? I have no idea. I don't know. Sorry? Okay, so let me tell you, in English, English has these articles, right, which are like always a challenge. So, but in English, the most common word is the. The second most common word is of. So the word the, if you look at, I don't know, if you were to count the number of letters in every article in today's New York Times, you would find that the word the appears about twice as often as the word the, and about 3 times as often as the third most common word, and so on and so forth. Zipf's law is, it's like in so many different contexts, and you just think that it shouldn't work, but it just always does. So here, if you just zoom in on the largest cities in Ukraine, you see that same sort of relationship, okay? So random growth, it's like, this is not really even quite a theory, it's more like a mechanic. What produces?
Applicable to the ones that are behind, right? So Odessa is then twice as big as Dnipro or it's just related to the first one?
So Kiev is about twice as big as Kharkiv, about 3 times as big as Odessa, about 4 times as large as Dnipro.
Yeah, if we look at Kharkiv, for example,
Yeah.
is it also applicable to that, or is it just applicable to the first city, the one that is?
Oh, no. Yeah, so if we just drop Kiev like that, we would see the same. This should be about twice as large as that.
Yeah,
about
that's
3
what I
times
meant.
as-
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I don't know. This is not quite a theory because we don't know, our theory doesn't tell us where these shocks come from, but the theory produces this relationship that we observe in practice. Okay. Then a third story that we could tell about economic geography is certain places are just very attractive places to have cities. Anybody know this city up here? I was hoping Jennifer would be here today. So this is Pittsburgh, and this little park right here is called Three Rivers Park because there are 1, 2, and then they merge into a third river. So 3 rivers in the center of the city. Of course there's a city there, right? It's like back when people and goods moved primarily by water, of course you would put a city where you have 3 rivers. And so that story, we can call that the location fundamentals story. Okay, so what does all of this imply for what we should expect to see if we look at the growth trajectory of Japanese cities after World War II? Well, if it's about increasing returns, then you might think that the cities that are bombed have lost a lot of what makes a city, and they're just going to shrink after the war. And the cities that were not, they're going to continue to grow. They're going to grow even faster after the war. So we should expect to see a positive correlation between the change in the wartime population and post-war population change. So we would expect to see that Hiroshima would just collapse as a city. And Tokyo would be much smaller relative to other Japanese cities than it was before the war because it was bombed so heavily. If the story is just random growth, then from the perspective of this simple theory, American bombing is just like one more shock, and there's no reason to expect that shock today, to expect what happens tomorrow. And so we should see no correlation between change in population during wartime and post-war population change. And finally, if it's about fundamentals, well, if Pittsburgh were destroyed, of course you would want to have a city still where you have 3 rivers. And so you're going to rebuild cities and places that are attractive places to have cities, which are by and large the places where you had cities before. And so you're going to see that the places that were bombed most heavily, they have the largest population decline during the war, are going to see the largest increase in population after the war. Max?
Yeah, when I was reading the article, actually, there's one thing that I was thinking about, that sometimes it's not about, if you have those rivers in Pittsburgh, and God forbid it's destroyed, people would be coming back not because of the location, which made sense historically, but because of other things probably, which are more important, because there are some investments already in the sewage, in something will remain, right? Mm-hmm. In addition to nostalgic, emotional things, there will be some capex already there, so it's easier and makes more sense to try and rebuild the city from what remains, rather than go into open field and build it from scratch.
Yeah, no, that's right. So the fundamentals of the location maybe change over time. So Pittsburgh's originally there because there are 3 rivers. Then Pittsburgh develops a steel industry, and that becomes the fundamental. And so even if, God forbid, something happened to Pittsburgh, you would still want to rebuild the steel industry where some of that remains. Incidentally, the steel industry is gone from Pittsburgh completely. Pittsburgh 50 years ago would be this very smoky place. It's like very difficult to see sometimes during the day because of all of the smoke from the steel mills. And then competition from foreign producers of steel drove a lot of American steel producers out of business. So I see this as well in Chicago, in South Chicago, and then in northern Indiana along the shore of Lake Michigan. This used to be another major center of steel production in the US, and there's still some steel production there, but it's like this much compared to what there was at the peak of the steel industry. So Pittsburgh today is more insurance and like lots of, we say, white collar industries with very clean air because the steel industry is gone. So that's interesting that the city survives even though its major industry disappears. Okay, so any guesses? Which story is right if we look at Japanese cities? If we look at their population growth after the war compared to what happens during the war. So Hiroshima sees a very large population decline during the war. Cities in the north that are out of range of B-29 bombers, they see very little. They might see population growth during the war because people are moving to those cities during the war. Which story is right here, do you think? How many people vote for number one? One person. How many people vote for number two? 2, 3 people, 4. How many people vote for number 3? Okay. Well, the wisdom of the crowd, and I guess I've already kind of hinted at this a little bit, but yeah, it's the cities that saw the largest population decline during the war are the cities that see the largest population increase after the war. That's kind of amazing, isn't it? Hiroshima grows more than cities that weren't bombed. The cities in the north, they grow much less. And so that seems to be a story about fundamentals, whether the fundamental is like the original thing that brought people there and made it a city, or whether it's then something that grew out of that. Okay, and so we think about then to what extent were these cities substantially rebuilt? What does it look like from the perspective of the end of the 20th century? Japanese cities, if you were to just look at the raw correlation between their population in 1920 and 1998, it's pretty close to perfect. So if you just looked at that, you would never have guessed that there was a war and the Japanese cities were bombed. The cities that were large in 1920 were large in 1998. They all were larger than before, but the larger the city in 1920, the larger the city in 1998. And if you just look at the correlation between the rank, so Tokyo is ranked number 1 in 1920, it's ranked number 1 in 1998. Other cities are ranked 2, 3, 4, 5. You just look at the correlation between the ranks, that's also pretty close to perfect. You would never have known there was a war. So what does this imply then for Ukraine? Well, there's been a lot of change in population since the start of the war, with some good or not so good estimates of what's happened. Let's just look at one city. Mariupol, by some estimates today, has a population of roughly 100,000 people versus close to 400,000 before the full-scale invasion. So if we were to just plot Mariupol's population and its rank in the same way, we would see it just slides up this line up here. And so if the story is about increasing returns or about just random shocks, then we might not expect Mariupol to be much of a city 20 years down the line. But the Japanese experience tells us that actually 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, we might see Mariupol have a population relative to other cities in Ukraine that's roughly equal to what it was before February 24th of last year. So I think that's maybe an optimistic story. Max?
Well, if I may, if I'm not mistaken, well, Mariupol has a long history as a settlement because of its location on the seashore.
Yeah.
But then the development or this stage of kind of rapid increase of population was due to the industrialization. So they have 2 steel mills there, and each of them employs, I don't know, like tens of thousands of people, or did employ.
Right.
So basically, this will be also an important factor of how quickly and to what extent the population kind of, gets back, or what happens to the city. Because originally, I mean, from the start of the industrialization, that growth was due to the growth of the metallurgy there.
Yeah, yeah. No, very good. So, yeah, what happens, whether that steel industry is rebuilt or not, seems like an important part of the story. Yeah. The microphone?
I have a small question.
Yeah.
I actually liked the article, but is it really the experience of Japan is applicable to Ukraine? Because Japan, after the Second World War, is kind of different country. It is isolated country. It's island country. It's country that was empirical towards the closest neighbors, Korea and China. So it's hard to imagine that Japanese population moves to those countries and start to their life there. USA as a destination for lots of migrants also is not very friendly to Japanese because they actually fight against each other during the Second World War. And the country is kind of like smaller than Ukraine. It's maybe approximately the same square kilometers as Poland, but populated is like twice or 3 times greater than countries with the same area. So maybe it's just inevitable that Japanese came to their previous cities, and because there is no other options actually, because of the small area, because there is nowhere to go, like the islands in Pacific Ocean. Another question, I'm not a specialist in rebuilding of Japan, but maybe USA was long time present in that country after the end of the war, and maybe investing in the areas that were bombed, redemption for the crimes that were performed. And the last maybe comment, comparing Mariupol to Tokyo, Tokyo is not close to USA that bombed that country and that city, but Mariupol and other cities on the eastern part of Ukraine is still close to Russia, and we can't expect that after the end of this war, another won't start, and people may be afraid to come back to that areas because they already experienced atrocities of the war, and they just may be afraid, and it will be overcome all the nostalgic or territorial arguments that could be present for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, that all sounds right to me. So maybe we can look at this Japanese paper as almost a sort of ideal case of the sort of rebuilding that you might expect to see following a war, when you don't have a neighbor, when you don't have an enemy at your doorstep that you have to worry about, when there's not been, I mean, after the war you had Japanese people who return to Japan from Korea. Ukraine needs to worry about the millions of people who have left the country and whether they're going to return to the country or not. There's a lot of differences, obviously, but at least this sort of best case scenario that the Japanese paper tells us suggests that cities are incredibly resilient. So, the other thing, though, to say about this is that there's a lot of cities up here in the distribution that, I don't know, think about the sort of settlements that have largely been destroyed in the east of the country, especially. And a lot of those settlements were there not because of any particular geographic advantage, but that's just because that's where Soviet planners put the cities. So there's a kolkhoz there, people lived on the kolkhoz, and with modern agricultural technology, you don't need to have agricultural laborers all located within a particular settlement, and perhaps that's not where the settlement needed to be to begin with. So the location fundamental story relies upon the idea that cities are formed because of the voluntary movement of people to places that make sense. But Soviet planning was substantially about creating cities in places that did not necessarily make sense. And we wouldn't necessarily expect then those cities to be as attractive places for rebuilding after the war. Comment over here?
Yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts. If you know, in the Soviet and countries, there were cities, the so-called monocities.
Yeah.
For example, Slavutic, that was built exclusively to serve the nuclear power plant of Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And it was basically a city that was existing because of the power plant, and then it collapsed. But the city still lives, still exists, and to me, it's interesting experience how living the cities actually are. Like their main purpose doesn't exist anymore, but the city exists, and they change, they adapt, and become something new.
I guess my question for you is, does the city persist in part just because of the costs of moving and people remain where they are? You think about those costs in various ways. You need to buy an apartment in another city. There's the cost of leaving your family, which remains in the city. But is that why the city survives, or is it just the, as you suggest, the, I don't know, entrepreneurial spirit of the human population that leads to adaptation? Like Pittsburgh survives even though there's no steel industry there anymore.
Yeah, I think it's also the case, but it's just like a complex process to me, and what you say is also present. If it's already a big city, there are a big population, then if your main source of like the goal of existing in the city perishes, then you just have to come up with some other ones, because you already have infrastructure, you have people, you have, you just you have to be creative and rethink it and create new meanings.
I mean, this is really interesting because one difference between Ukraine and Japan is that Japan did not have these one industry towns. Japanese industry was in fact incredibly dispersed at the time of the war, and this was, if you want a strategic rationale for the bombing of Japanese cities, the rationale that was given at the time was that the only way to destroy Japanese industry is to destroy Japanese cities, because it's lots of little shops. It's not just some big factory you can bomb. You need to destroy the city in order to destroy the productive capacity of the nation. And so that's a very different sort of economic structure than in a country like Ukraine, where as a legacy of Soviet planning, you have a lot of cities that historically were centered around one single industrial establishment. But it's interesting that some of those cities, even before the war, we saw adapting to economic change and surviving when ex ante we might not have thought that to be the case. Other thoughts?
Excuse me,
Yeah.
I also would like to share and ask the question. I would like to ask you about Israel, because Israel was created by, in principle, by kibbutz.
Yeah.
Because the first kibbutz was beginning of last century, 1903, and the kibbutz were so much growing that in 1945 it was too less land for them to grow up. And that's why they, in principle, one of the reasons to create Israel was this community which was becoming very strong. And we have had some kind of small kibbutz in military area. It was Zaporozhskaya Sich, where it was also some kind of different community, culture, tradition, which was growing and was very strong. As far as I understand, what I see now, that Ukraine wants to give up very much Soviet background and looking back to their most common for our history. And our history is a small community which was very strong, and now Gromada is also taking place very strong. And what is your opinion? Can such big industrial city like Donetsk, like Mariupol, become a kibbutz, as a kind of kibbutz, or industrial cluster, which will be specialized, depends on their area, like, for example, steel industry or agriculture and so on? Can be a new way of development in this area?
Listen, I defer to the judgment of others, but let me just say that from the perspective of an outsider, the decentralization reform in Ukraine was an enormously positive development, and decisions like this should be made at the local level and not by the center. So one of the things I've learned on this trip is that there's apparently a piece of legislation currently being discussed in the parliament about various aspects of urban planning and real estate development, and that there is a proposal passage in this bill that would transfer authority for approving building projects from local governments to the central government. And so, as an outsider, that seems to me to be a potentially very counterproductive development. If during this process of rebuilding after the war, when you have tens and hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into the country, if decisions about whether this building or that building should be built using this reconstruction money, if those decisions are all being made in Kiev rather than by local governments, to me that doesn't sound like the right process.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah, microphone.
Yeah, I have a question since previous lecture, because Jennifer and you both give us an example of Germany and Japan as a positive example of renovation, but I kind of disagree with that. Because both Germany and Japan has different culture than we. They both I'd rather name them army with the country than country with the army. So their population, their nations, very disciplined and they attached to the country and family and I don't know, cities. But in Ukraine, it's different. So we have now we have problem with the population. Of course, a lot of people return, but also a lot of will not. And in Europe, in general, we have decreased trend to population. We have all Europe have the population problem. So does not it mean that we have to attract people from other nations to fill that gap, population gap, and it can give an impact to our culture in general. For me, I guess it's a really bad news, but maybe it's we can't avoid it. What do you think about it?
Listen, I mean, this seems like a really profound question. So Japan, as you probably know, has suffered a problem with low fertility for years. The Japanese population is stagnant or declining. And they have made a conscious decision not to encourage immigration to the country for the sake of maintaining a traditional culture. My country historically has made a very different decision, that it's a country with large numbers of people, always has been, from other parts of the world. Our Ukrainian village in Chicago is the center of a really thriving Ukrainian population with thousands of people. You go there, it's just a very thriving retail, commercial environment. Lots of Ukrainian stores and restaurants and so forth. And historically, in my country, the national identity has been capacious enough to incorporate all the new people who have moved to the country, that you're American as soon as you take that oath of citizenship. It's not about a language, a skin color, having been born in the country or not. So my observation is that there's been an enormous increase in the strength of Ukrainian identity, not just since the full-scale invasion last year, but really for the past decade, maybe the past 2 decades, the Orange Revolution and then the Revolution of Dignity. And yet, as you say, at the same time, there's been an enormous movement of people out of the country. Millions of people living in Europe, especially now. Some of them will not come back. And so this is going to be a question for Ukraine, how to deal with a smaller population than it had before, and whether to encourage people to move to Ukraine from elsewhere, and whether this incredible sense of Ukrainian identity that we have seen develop, which like even spills over into my country, where you see Ukrainian flags hanging in the front of houses in small towns in the Midwest, whether that Ukrainian identity is capacious enough to incorporate other people who might choose to move to the country, or whether that's not the right decision for Ukraine. Obviously, that's, you know, it's not my position to say what the right decision is, but it will be. It seems like a big one. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so then listen, tomorrow we have one more lecture at the same time. You'll get me one more time. And tomorrow we'll be talking about oligarchs. Okay, so see you then.